Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to people all around the world who are joining me here with my colleague Steve Spear at MIT Sloan Executive Education's LinkedIn Live event, where we will be discussing Steve Spear's recent book, Wiring the Winning Organization, which came out last year, and a number of other topics of, I think, general interest in this overall field. So again, I'm Peter Hurst, Senior Associate Dean for Executive Education at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And thank you, Steve, for joining me here to talk about your book. Just by way of a little more background on Steve. Steve is a senior lecturer at the Sloan School of Management. He teaches graduate and executive education programs. He's advised many graduate theses. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute of Healthcare Improvement and associated faculty at Adrian Labs of the Harvard School of Public Health. Widely published in Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review, a bunch of other journals, a lot in relation to healthcare fields as well. Interestingly, maybe we can talk a bit about that as the conversation goes on today. But Steve really has been a prolific contributor to executive education programs over many years now, and really the sense of his research and what he shares with executives and organizations through his consulting and through executive education teaching, if I could sum it up, would be that some businesses and other kinds of organizations seem to find a way to really radically outperform their peers, their industry, and in many cases other industries as well. Many others try to emulate them, and not all succeed in doing that. And so Steve has really spent his career trying to understand why that is, not just for purely academic reasons, but for very practical reasons, to help organizations and businesses actually get better and be successful in the way that the absolutely most successful ones are. And so Steve's publications, his books, his articles, his teaching in exec ed, all deals with essentially that proposition. But Steve, I've kind of painted a picture very broadly there. Perhaps you could, my first question to you before we get into the book itself could be just to sort of share a little bit from your perspective about what's kind of motivated your career and the problem that you set out to try to solve in the world, and what you've learned about that.
Yeah, Peter, thanks for the question. But more broadly, I wanted to say thank you for the opportunity. You mentioned that I've made some contributions into the MIT Sloan Executive Education Program. I just want to say it's been such a fabulous platform in which to develop ideas, test ideas, get feedback, test formats, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to give compliment to you and your colleagues who've done just a marvelous job of making it easy for us in the faculty side to bring ideas out into those who can put them to good use, and then get feedback from them how the ideas are working so we can iteratively improve upon them. As to your question, let me just get to the punchline first. Bottom line up front is that management matters, which is a good thing to assert from a management school. But in particular, where my research is really focused on, management matters to the extent to which management systems can liberate the ingenuity, the creative potential, which is distributed throughout the enterprise, liberate it towards individually, and then through collective action towards common purpose, liberate it to solving really hard problems for which the solutions have great value in society. Now, in terms of the motivation for all that, I came to this as a graduate student at the Sloan School some 30 years ago, when we were really concerned about the huge disparities in sectors. So in the auto sector, for example, you had Toyota, which was delivering quality, productivity, time to market, speed in introducing new technology, new brands, et cetera, versus everybody else. And when you start looking within a sector, and everything is the same, right? The availability of science, technology, capital equipment, natural resources, the opportunities are the same because you're trying to identify opportunities in the marketplace. And then you have everything is the same other than the outcome. It starts already inviting you to start looking at the management systems. And it turns out, though, that autos is not the only example. It wasn't the only example where there's huge disparities between best and everybody else. Sector by sector by sector, and no matter what phase of value creation at which one looks, whether it's way upstream discovery, research, design, development, et cetera, all the way through delivery, you have these same disparities of some select few whose ability to generate and deliver value to society is way out of proportion to everybody else. And so when you see these huge disparities within sectors and see these disparities repeating across sectors, you start erasing possible explanations like, oh, it's something about the regulatory system, the rule system, the legal system, the financial system, the supply chain. It all boils down to what's going on inside the enterprise, which is the management system. When you then start thinking, well, what's common across all these disparate enterprises is that they all have their own particular set of problems that are characteristic of their sector, their phase of value creation. And the ones that win are the ones that see and solve problems with a rapidity and a breadth and an excellence far outscaling everybody else. So management matters, and in particular, management matters to the extent that it liberates our collective creativity towards solving really hard problems.
Great. You've been studying this field now for quite a long time. Your first book came out I think over a decade ago, The High Velocity Edge, and you've just published last year this new book, Wiring the Winning Organization.
Yep.
So what were some of the key ideas from your book that was represented from the work represented in your initial book, and what's changed?
Yeah, no, thank you. So the first book grew out of a lot of work I had done initially as a doctoral student under the supervision of MIT professor emeritus Kent Bowen, studying Toyota. Because again, that was the sector that got so much attention in the late 80s, early 90s, in terms of Toyota out here, in terms of outperforming everybody on virtually every metric. And in that, we started our very first article reported out of that dissertation was this apparent paradox, which is on the one hand, Toyota was recognized for all this issues of standardization, et cetera, yet they proved to be the most agile, adaptive company in their sector. And we said, what's up with that? And our answer to that was, whereas most people had been looking at Toyota through the 80s into the 90s and this emergence of lean production, lean manufacturing, et cetera, looking for shop floor production control tools, that sort of thing. We said, no, what they missed is the point that Toyota had created a management system that turned it, and this was to paraphrase BMW's tagline at the time, the ultimate driving machine. We said Toyota was the ultimate learning machine, that every day people came in to do work, and either they succeeded at the work they were doing or they succeeded at figuring out how to do the work better the next day, or both in most cases. And so the first book really focused on this problem-solving dynamic as the creative engine that drove Toyota's success. And elsewhere in the Toyota, which occupies the middle of that book, it's bracketed by examples in the beginning of phenomenal experiences at Alcoa, which achieved near perfect workplace safety despite the hazards of its industrial processes. The Navy's experience gestating, maturing, and deploying nuclear propulsion with perfect safety in the 70 years since that first came about. And then it's bracketed on the other side with examples of transformation in healthcare, taking struggling systems and making them exceptional on patient safety, quality of care, cost, access, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the first book. And it was really the identification of this learning engine as the power behind great enterprises. Moving into the second book, Wiring the Winning Organization, a couple of, I wouldn't say changes, but additions. One is we wildly expanded the set of examples. So if the first book is a lot of Toyota with 3 or 4 other deep dive case studies bracketing fore and aft, the second book, we have some 24 case studies to just demonstrate the breadth of these principles. And the other thing is the first book was very much a focus on processes which had sort of a linear quality to them. And the second book, we got much deeper into the question of if we're competing on this learning engine, what is it we do to, one, make problems easier to solve in the first place. And that drew on a different research tradition and legacy. And then we get into the second question, in general, as opposed to this very particular case of linear processes, what can we do to make problems themselves simpler to solve? And then, again, illustrated through these many, many case studies and some deep dive into a simple explanatory theory, then we say, well, if there are these three mechanisms, one is to make problems easier to solve, the second to make problems make problem solving easier to do. The second is to make problems easier to solve. And then there's this third mechanism of making it more obvious that you even have a problem in the first place.
Okay, thank you. And just from the title of the new book, it sort of hints that you might also have been thinking more deeply or looking more deeply into sort of what have been the implications of technology in more recent times. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, that's right. Again, the first book was written in 2010, and I think one of the case studies in there was celebrating, and I apologize for this, celebrating the emergence of digital advertising, which now we look upon it as the source of spam and identity tracking. A lot's changed since then, and I think what's really quite remarkable is that whether we're looking at quote unquote, old economy or new economy or cutting edge economy, the recurring pattern is that the winners are those that, despite all the technology and all the technological change, are those that create far more conducive environment for the human mind to express itself, regardless of what the technological milieu happens to be.
Okay, can we dig a little bit more into that, perhaps? Because thinking about the most recent developments, it's so hard to keep up, right? Thinking about everything that we're hearing about artificial intelligence and its implications right now. How important is technological change, particularly digital technology, to the kinds of principles that you've been exploring in this book?
Yeah. So digital technology is a fascinating thing, both in terms of the product of the human mind and a tool the human mind can use to give fuller expression to the potential of the human mind. And I think that, Peter, when we talk about technology, we often forget, then we talk about technical systems, that we're not yet at the stage of pure autonomy where the technical systems exist outside of. They exist in the context of society. So we're really always talking about social technical systems. And while we can focus on the technology, if we stop focusing on we lose sight of very important elements of the social systems, which are both the creators of this technology and the users of it. And when we go through the book, we start talking about, fabulous systems that have been created historically and recently. And I think the two largest systems we talk about in the book, one is we give an example, again, to this notion of the disparity between great performance and not. So we use NASA multiple times as an example because it has, fortunately, some great examples, unfortunately, some not great examples. And we use as the great examples the ability to send a man to the moon and return him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade, culminating Apollo 11 landing with Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, and also a more recent probe called DART, which landed a probe on an asteroid to see if it could be deflected as a first step towards planetary defense against extraterrestrial objects. Huge successes. And then you have the failures, obviously, of Columbia and Challenger. So we use that as an example. Then another huge system is Amazon and other folks who develop these cloud services, AWS and whatnot. And what's fascinating about that is, one is an example out of the 60s. One is the example, still aerospace out of the 2000s. One is, pure digital out of the 2000s. And you see recurring patterns, right? So one is no one could have designed either the Apollo program or AWS or DART, somewhere in between, right? All of these are the product of collective intelligence, not individual intelligence. And we started looking at the strategies that the successful enterprises use. All of them said, in order to accomplish this, we're going to have to engage so many human minds in the hundreds of thousands. How do we do that? Well, the first thing what we have to do is simplify the situation. and break this huge problem into its many smaller pieces so we can have smaller, coherent, functional groups engaged on the pieces so that the pieces are simpler. They have fewer factors in play simultaneously. They're more controllable. We can run experiments and trials faster, quicker, with more meaningful feedback, and then have these modules then reconnect in a meaningful architecture to have very high performance. And in the book, we describe NASA's strategy of taking this modular approach and this very incremental approach towards achieving success with the moon landing, and similarly with Amazon, discarding what was a behemoth of a highly convoluted, complicated, intertwined, unmanageable business system, and breaking it into many, many smaller pieces, which gave it huge flexibility, huge agility, huge reliability, resilience, on and on. And so we see that. So Peter, to your question about what's the role of technology, obviously technology changes the conditions in which we're operating. It changes the tools available to us. It changes the object of our design intent. But what doesn't change is the powers and the limitations of the human mind, which is why management systems really have to be designed intentionally around taking advantage of the powers of the human mind, working individually and collaboratively and collectively, and also those limitations.
Great, thank you. Just sticking to this sort of comparative theme of then and now, and actually there's a question in the thread from Eddie Shadowski, which I think is sort of goes to this a little bit. Was, when you were writing the high velocity edge, the question, a question which you talked about a little bit just now, is why did so many companies fail in their efforts to kind of emulate what, in that particular case, Toyota, and I think Alcoa was another example that we spoke about. Why did they fail? And my kind of update to that question is, more than 10 years later, you've written sort of a new book, and in some ways the hypothesis still seems to be the same, that there are still companies that are nailing it, and there are companies that are, if not failing, not nailing it in the same way. So is there, are the reasons the same, that companies that weren't successful 15, 20 plus years ago that you were studying back then still translated today, or is it a new set of challenges that are causing the problems now?
Yes, I appreciate that. So there's a guy I'm working with on a project, a guy named Scott Harvey, and people are asking about this first pass on really changing the performance of an enterprise. And some of the change in performance is really quite remarkable in terms of quality, productivity, et cetera, et cetera. And when people come and say, "Hey, Scott, well, what did you do differently?" Because they see, dozens and dozens of different practical changes in how the work was performed, Scott's answer to that is, we just changed our behavior. And people say, no, but tell me what you did. He said, we changed our behavior. And now here's where Scott is being insistent on this, is that all the tools and techniques which made it easier to do the work of this enterprise, they were the output of what? The change in behavior. So what was the change in behavior? Is that initially there was a lot of tolerance for ambiguity. There was a lot of tolerance for workarounds. There was lack of a commitment to creating quote unquote standards. And people sometimes react to the term standard as, oh, that's command and control. And we would argue, no, actually a standard is just our best declaration of what actions we think will have what outcomes. It's our best understanding in the moment. And the reason we use a standard is both to increase our chance for success, but also make it obvious much earlier on that we're failing, so we can stop and pause and regain understanding of the situation, regain control of the situation, and create a new standard. It's like cooking. We have a recipe which we use until the food doesn't taste good, then we update the recipe. So anyway, in terms of Scott's point about we just change our behavior, and to the great question, I think it was Ed who asked, well, the examples have changed, the technological context has changed, the economic context has changed. So this still sounds the same. Why is it? Because we're still talking about how to engage people in collaborative, creative invention. And it still requires, whether we're talking way back in the day when people were inventing the wheel or the steam engine, or more sophisticated cars, or AWS and advanced interplanetary probes today, that's still the issue, right? Which is, how do we get full benefit of the intellect distributed through the enterprise. And the way we do that is we change our behavior. So one way to behave is we give people these wildly complex problems, which are largely impossible to solve. I mean, there's a social impossibility. There's actually sometimes a mathematical impossibility. And so our behavior is, do we or don't we deconstruct and partition the problem into smaller coherent pieces so that it's actually solvable in its pieces, and then we can assemble it into a meaningful whole. That's a behavioral choice. That's not a technological imperative. Similarly, there's another, we just changed our behavior, which is, do we actually run our systems in such a way that it's obvious we have problems? That's a term in the new book we call amplification. Do we actually build systems that amplify problems? So we say, ooh, Peter, hold on. We've got an issue here. And now what we need to do is slow down, a mechanism we call slowification, one of the three. Are we going to slow down, get out of the operating mode, the execution mode, and step back to a feedback-rich planning, preparation, practice, so that we have a new standard to bring forward into execution? So Ed's question is a great one, is that the situations have changed enormously in the 15 years since the first book was written, and I think the 20, 30 years since it was researched. But the commonality is the human mind and the management systems that allow it to get fullest expression.
And before I turn to another question, which and please keep them coming in the LinkedIn thread, by the way, folks, these are great to see. You touched on something there. You said slow down. And sort of, I've heard you talk about this idea before, which is, slowing down to speed up. Could you say some more about, what you've seen actually works in order to be able to do that? Because I think what most of us are familiar with is just, having more and more complex, challenging things to do, and more competition, and the idea of somehow decoupling from that is something which I think a lot of us struggle with. So what's your advice on that?
Yeah, no, it is a great question, and thank you for asking it. So the failure mode for a lot of organizations, this ties back to Ed's question, which is, well, what's changed? And the answer is nothing. I mean that with some air quotes. What hasn't changed is the pressures we all feel to maintain operational tempo, despite evidence that what we're doing is not working. And so we kind of get into this, despite the evidence it's not working, we're so compelled to maintain operational tempo, we don't stop and fix what is not working. And what we find with outstanding organizations is that, again, we just behave differently. To Scott Harvey's point, they behave differently. When they see that something is wrong, rather than maintain operational tempo, or in fact insist on a faster tempo to catch up because things are not going right, they somehow figure out a way to say, oh, we got to take a pause, take a breather, figure out what's going wrong, and fix it, and then bring the new idea into practice. I'll illustrate it with one example. It's an MIT example, so a little self-serving. But right in the start of the section around this mechanism we call slowification, which is getting out of our fast-thinking, impulsive, reactive behavior and get into a more contemplative, creative, generative, self-reflective mode. We have a case study about an MIT Sloan School sailing team, and it's captained by now a graduate, a guy named Adam Traina. Adam and some of his classmates said, oh, we want to have a sailing team. Here's the problem. At the MIT Sloan School, may not be a surprise, there aren't that many experienced sailors, let alone experienced sailing racers. So they form a team, and they sign up to go to a very prestigious regatta somewhere in the Mediterranean. And when they get off the plane in whatever destination this is, they're getting off the plane, and their teammates are saying, but we've never sailed before. And so what ends up happening, Adam, David, and some of his other classmates say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to the starting line with everybody else, and we're going to start racing. But the moment we discover we're confused, we're going to stop. We're going to have a discussion on board the boat, figure out what's the confusion, figure out a better way to approach what we're doing, and start again. Then we're going to sail. And then the moment we get confused again or have some other difficulty, we're going to stop. And that becomes their operating ethos. Do your work till you see a problem. When you see a problem, stop and solve it. Well, anyway, here's how it goes, is that Adam, you can imagine what it looks like in the first heat of the first day's racing. Everyone else is sailing, and MIT's boat is largely bobbing, because they start sailing and they have problems within the first few seconds, and they start sailing again, another problem. So the first heat, and they got blown out. They come back for the second heat, And it's largely bobbing along, but with some sailing. But actually, by the end of the last heat, they're in the front of the pack. Now, they don't make the finals that year because they, lost so much space on heats 1, 2, and 3. But they come back the second year, same ethos. They've graduated a bunch of sailors, but now they have a much better, higher level of understanding what to do, how to do it. They teach that. And the first heat, same thing. Sail until you get into difficulty, stop and fix it. But wouldn't you know, that second year, they make it to the finals, and in the finals, they win. They come back the third year, same ethos, because now they need a new captain because Adam and the other guys have graduated. Also, the other captains have graduated. Same ethos, though. Take what we learned in years 1 and 2 and build on it by how, when we see a problem, stop, slowify, and fix on it. They win for the second time in a row, the third time in a row, the fourth time in a row. Anyway, as we say in the book, eventually they apply for entry into the regatta again, and they don't get a response. And they apply again, and they don't get a response. And finally, they call up and say, "Oh, how come you're not accepting us?" And the sponsor says, "Look, we're using the regatta as advertising. We can't keep giving away the same trophies to the same team each year. We got to give someone else a chance." But anyway, to the point, Peter, about the slowification, Adam and David and some of the other captains that first year had uncommon discipline to change their behavior versus the behavior on the other boats. When they saw a problem, they actually stopped, got out of fast thinking into slow thinking, solved the problem, took the newly generated understanding into the next round of performance, and got better and better and better to the point that they were destroying the competition.
Fascinating example, and might be an answer to a question that someone asked, Elena asked a little while ago, but let me ask it for her anyway to give you a chance to expand. Her question was, based on your research and experience, do you think it's more valuable or important to have knowledge and experience, or to be able to learn?
Yeah, so I'm going to go with it's about character and behavior and the willingness, where the character comes in. And what I mean by this is not that you steal or not. I think we can agree that's like a baseline that, we're honest. But the character is, are we willing to enter situations? And this is a term I finished the high velocity edge with, a term, we're willing to enter situations with a humble optimism rather than an arrogant pessimism. And to set up the contrast, an arrogant pessimism is that I'm in a situation and there's nothing else to be learned. On the one hand, that's arrogant. It's like, oh, I know everything that there is. But on the other hand, to say that everything to be known already is known means that there's no opportunity for betterment. So that's the pessimism. What seems to be characteristic of these great winning organizations and those who lead them is a humble optimism, which is no matter what we are doing, there's that represents only a fraction of what might be the theoretical limit. And that's where the optimism comes in, tied to the humility, which is if I start off by admitting that what I know and what I'm capable of doing is just a mere shadow of what's possible, then the optimism is all this unexplored frontier of better and better and better. So to Elena's question, better to hire on as she phrased it exactly, are we hiring on knowledge or willingness to learn? It's willingness to learn. And when we look at the great organizations, whether it's Toyota, where I have deep roots, or the Navy's nuclear propulsion program, or some other great organizations today, I think what we'll find is the willingness to learn in this humble, optimistic way, and willingness to lead in a similarly humble, optimistic way is characteristic of the winners. And this arrogant pessimism is characteristic of those who may be flash in the pans, but their ability to sustain, it's not going to be there.
Great, thank you. And then this sort of moves us, I think, in the direction of you're painting a good picture of the sort of the vision of the kinds of cultures and behaviors and ways of beings that you'd advocate for. But Bogdan and others in the thread are asking more kind of the how question. For example, what have you seen that there are particular kind of structures or approaches to sort of creating and leading and managing organizations that are either beneficial or even necessary to
Right.
get the kind of outcomes that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, it's a great question about the structure to get the right dynamics. So, one, I appreciate the question. Sort of put aside, is this dependent on sector technology? I think we've tried to, by process of elimination, say it's not that. As far as the structure in the book, we talk about how one, the slowification we were just discussing to make it easier to solve problems. Then we go into this mechanism of modularization, incrementalization, linearization to make the problems simpler to solve. So that becomes a key issue. Related to that, we talk about, we introduce another term called isomorphism. And what we mean by that is that we have all different ways to think about how we structure organizations, and the metaphor or the icon for that is the organizational chart with CEO and then roles and functions broken down. If we get back to this notion, though, that we create enterprises in large part to collectively solve problems which we can't solve individually, then there's a topography to the problems itself. And we talk about how organizations have to be isomorphic, a nice fancy sounding term, that the structure of the organization, the enterprise, has to match the topography of the problems themselves. So we have the right people able to talk to the right other people in the right other functions and disciplines about the same problem at the same time to solve it. And in the book, there's a number of examples of organizations which succeeded brilliantly because the organizational form matched the topography of the problems. And then as the problem topography shifted, if the organizational form kept up, they continued to succeed. But on the other hand, as the problem topography shifted, the organizational form didn't keep up, they had some great difficulty. And we have some examples there drawing on great research by Kim Clark, Rebecca Anderson, and a bunch of others, which provide the theory and the evidence about this. So let me pause there, but just offer two things which listeners can access. I mentioned this term isomorphism and a bunch of other terms. They're all contained within the first few pages of the book. Our goal when we wrote the book was that if you read nothing but section 1, which is all about 60 pages, you get every idea. And the rest of the several hundred pages in the book is nothing but illustration with cases or deeper dive into the theory. But if you read 66 pages, you get the whole thing. And so if people would like a copy of that excerpt, they're welcome to it. I'll make it available to you, your colleagues, or they can just reach out directly. The other is in the book, we make a very big deal about this notion of a quote unquote model line. And this ties back to, we just changed our behavior. So the idea of a model line is you take the whole enterprise, which may have hundreds of thousands of people, and find some representative microcosm, as small as one or just a few people doing the direct work of transforming information and material into a better, more usable form. But the key point of the microcosm is that you have connection to the many supporting functions that support the direct work. And what you try and do is take that microcosm and practice the skills of slowification to make problem solving easier to do, simplification to make the problems easier to solve, and amplification to make it more obvious that there are problems. Anyway, we wrote a supplement to the book around this model line concept. And if people are interested, we can make that easily available as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And when you talk about a line, that in my mind conjures up sort of a manufacturing sort of setting where I know a lot of your work has been done, but you worked in a lot of other industries and sectors as well. Could you share a little bit with us, just kind of how these ideas work quite universally, or where maybe they're different across industries?
Yeah, absolutely. And Peter, it's a great segue question, because I use the term line, and it's a good, you did a very gentle correction on there. It sounds like the model line is something which exists horizontally, receiving through shipping, as we do material transformation. And let me just elaborate on that and then give other examples. When we really talk about model line, in this case, microcosm, it's a very, very small footprint of work. And the line is actually not horizontal, receiving the shipping, as it were. It's this vertical connectivity between the people who are doing the direct work of the organization and those in more and more senior roles who have to support or create the conditions in which this work occurs. So the model line is not the start to finish of the material transformation, literally or metaphorically. It's actually the line is this vertical support of that direct work. Now, in terms of model line and where else we've applied it, myriad settings. So you mentioned, and I appreciate the reference to the work we've done in healthcare. So when we started in healthcare, we would often start with a single doctor, single nurse, a single medical team. With the constant challenge, what impedes them from having just immediate, smooth performance of the work they do for diagnosis, assessment, treatment, and cure of patients? And again, the model line, to the point you were making, it wasn't this flow, it was this support. And the experiences there of build up the model line and then take the lessons learned about how to behave differently. Those fanned out from the single clinical practitioners to entire practices and sometimes to very large systems. Similarly, the same approach of the model line starting small footprint, long leg. We were doing work with an electronics firm where the model line, in terms of direct work, was a single engineer. His specialty, this guy named Matt, his specialty was debugging firmware. And the beautiful thing about Matt was he always said, well, we don't make cars. He was teasing me because my background is with research about Toyota. He says, we don't make cars, but I'll give this a try. And he gave it a try. And then he got some success out of that. And then we said, well, Matt, how about your colleagues? Said, well, we don't make cars, but I'll give it a try. And then that had some traction in it. Matt, how about expanding it further? Well, anyway, ended up that, Matt with this joke about, well, I'll give it a try anyway. They got to the point that their rate of firmware debugging was 18x the start. And why was that? Because to debug firmware wasn't just about the creativity of the individual looking at the code. It was about how that person was connected to this larger supporting network of people in different functions with different resources to bring. And then just as a third example, so we sort of add to the range, almost in parallel to when we were doing the work with the electronics firm, we were working with a pharmaceutical company that was trying to radically reduce the time in a critical phase of drug development. And again, that model line was handfuls of people, a number of chemists in a chemistry lab, a number of biologists in a biology lab at first. They also took this approach of simplifying the work so it was more obvious what the steps were, who connected to whom and what, slowifying to keep stepping back and have creative, deliberative, self-reflective, self-critical thinking about how they were doing their work rather than just succumbing to the pressures of operational tempo. And they were far, far more sensitive, this amplification mechanism, about recognizing when they were having a problem and actually slowing down to solve it. Long and short, what started off as a small model line spread from chemistry to biology to purification to a chem supply to a bunch of other functional silos. They were able to take the time through this phase of drug development from well over a year to well under 6 months. And the output of that phase was much better by orders of magnitude than ever had been previously recorded. So anyway, to the question someone's asking about other places in this model line. Model line is the verticality, not the horizontal nature of it, and across a variety of different sectors.
Great, thank you for clarifying. And a little while ago, while you were talking earlier, there was a question about, it sounds like a lot of what I'm paraphrasing here, but it sounds like a lot of what you're describing is sort of describing innovation and how to be more innovative. And there's generally believed to be a kind of tension between being innovative versus being efficient.
Right.
Do you agree? And what's your take on that?
No. Yeah, look, end of day, look, code doesn't work. We know that, right? Whether it's the code we put into technical systems, that's why we have reboots and refreshes and upgrades and that sort of thing. Whether it's the business models we're using, which we discover are becoming less and less relevant, and we have to innovate to develop new business models to succeed in a changing environment. And internal to the enterprise, however we're conducting ourselves, that also in the moment was the best known approach given the conditions of that moment. But it's not necessarily the best approach, just the best known in the moment. And of course, the moment keeps changing. So this idea, whether it's innovation to figure out better what to do to meet the needs of society as a whole, or innovation internal to figure out how we do it, we still have the problem of trying to, in an enterprise, of engaging the power of the human mind to see and solve problems with great rapidity, complex problems, difficult problems, in a collaborative, collective approach. So yeah, I take certain offense, actually, a product of both the Sloan School and the Engineering School at MIT, when people say, "Oh, well, this is the innovative behavior and that's the execution behavior," as if actually getting something to run reliably, resiliently, with agility, somehow that's just a plug and play. It's not, and anyone who's ever been in any kind of facility will understand that the amount of ingenuity just to keep something running is extraordinary too.
So I hear you. A lot of people, and there were some comments earlier as well saying, to what extent are these behaviors that are perhaps short term, imposed by senior leaders in large organizations, and maybe they are responding to what they perceive as being the immediate market and investor kind of expectations as well. But let me ask this in a slightly different way. Sandra, I think, had asked about this as well. What do you see as being the role of leaders and leadership in shifting organizations to working these ways? And in particular, if I may, what do you do if you're not the CEO? How can you help?
Yeah, so I've spent a number of years working with a guy named Joe Bartow. He's a West Point graduate, veteran, and he teaches a program on leadership. And the thing I've taken away from Joe is that leadership doesn't mean you have to be the CEO or the general. Leadership simply is you are responsible for the conditions in which other people exist, and in the case of in the workplace, the conditions in which someone else works. And one of the things I've taken away from Joe and the many other members of the military with whom I've worked is that that's a community which they start thinking about leadership at the very junior enlisted level. So someone may enlist and go to a boot camp or other form of induction, and already they're teaching them how to lead, even if it's one other guy or gal. When they're very junior enlisted coming out of the boot camp and they're now part of the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, Space Force, whatever else it happens to be, if they're in charge of a squad, they actually teach them how to be responsible for the people in their squad. And when they go from a squad to something bigger and bigger and bigger, they're constantly taught about how to be responsible for the people for whom they're responsible, how to create the conditions for the people for whom they're responsible. Anyway, back to your point, is that all of us have opportunity to lead. We don't have to be the quote unquote, have the functional authority or the formal authority of the most senior people in the organization, so long as we have responsibility for other people. And we have some agency about changing the conditions in which they do their work. We have opportunity to lead. And once we have opportunity to lead, then leadership is a choice. It's not given or taken. It's a, do we lead or not? And sometimes the best we can do, the limited agency we have, is just the emotional tone of the workplace, because we may not have any agency over dollars or layout or anything physical, but we do have agency over the type of conversations we have, the nature of the conversations we have. Do we take pauses to reflect and self-correct? Are we defensive? We're accusative. So anyway, leadership can exist by choice, very local and small, very expansive and large, but it can exist. And then it's our question, do we accept that opportunity or not?
Great, thank you. And changing tack a bit, but I think it expands on what you were just talking about here as well. Bogdan asked a question about, he says he hears you advocating for the importance of learning, and if I can put some words in his mouth a little bit as well, in business school, we certainly sort of often will think, well, if something's important, we should measure it, and you kind of get what you measure, or you become what you measure. So, what have you seen as being effective in terms of actually being able to quantify the kind of learning that you're advocating for is actually happening?
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and it's an invitation to go like full tilt turbocharged nerd on this one. So I'm gonna do that, but I'm gonna keep it brief. Is that metrics have some value, but they have value in one of two ways. One is to allow retrospective celebration or condemnation about what happened in the past, and the other is metrics have value, and this is another, MIT reference to Claude Shannon and theory of communication. Metrics have value if they arrive in such a way that they help us change our behavior in a meaningful, timely way. This fellow, Claude Shannon, had a number of seminal papers on the topic. And one of them is that if we're trying to have quote unquote control over something, the whatever the frequency with which that thing operates, we actually have to be taking metrics off of it twice as fast. We have to take it with twice the detail, even more than that. So here's the thing about metrics is that sometimes the best metrics are simply binary. Is the thing working as designed or not? And if it's not, then we have to slowify. We have to pause, investigate why, understand why, and then construct a new approach, which is a new experiment, the new hypothesis as to how to succeed better. I think where we can really hamper ourselves is in our outlandish attempts to find more and more metrics which create better and better models. Perhaps that's descriptive, perhaps that's explanatory, but it's not good for the purpose of dynamically controlling a system real time. And this, harkens back not only to Claude Shannon, but also Jay Forrester, who is the Dean of System Dynamics, which is idiosyncratic to the Sloan School. And that is sort of a core capability we try to convey to our students. So anyway, I would say if we get the right behaviors around creating coherent work groups, which are allowed to amplify problems, and we know we need to slow down, and we know we need to simplify, we know we need to problem solve. Just the simple observational metric, as it were, are we behaving that way, is a very good predictor of good outcomes. On the other hand, if we become burdened by looking for the perfect metric systems, we'll be so burdened and distracted by that, we'll lose sight of the behavior we're trying to create.
I think that I was seeing some strong agreement with you on several of these points about leadership, and people like these ideas. I think they're very powerful. But if we could just stick with learning for a little bit longer in our closing sort of segment here, people can obviously read the book, but you also teach about these ideas in degree programs and exec ed programs. You have a couple coming up. I'm just checking, creating high velocity organizations, April 16th to 17th, which is taught on Zoom. You're doing essentially that same course again, I think, later in the year in October on campus. Could you just share, your approach to how do you actually practically teach these ideas, these materials in quite short spaces of time, and what kind of outcomes you're seeing from that?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, so just to plug the courses, we come in 3 formats. Live in person, that's the one in the fall you mentioned. Live online, which is the one next month. Not too late to sign up, you and your friends. Could be an early holiday gift, who knows, or a birthday. And then we also do an asynchronous version. What I would suggest in terms of this learning and how we introduce it in these courses and the design of systems that allow collective collaborative learning is we take a very MIT approach on this. And, behind you, Peter, your backdrop is Killian Court of MIT. And for those who come to the in-person version of the course, or just happen to look online at pictures of Killian Court itself, you'll notice that on the friezes is inscribed of great luminaries in the science and the arts. And I'll just use one as an example. You have Isaac Newton's name, or Newton, in very, very large letters, and perched on top of it is Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and others. And if one studies the collection of Newton and some of the other great thinkers from human history, what merits giant letters is that the person with giant letters took the extraordinary discoveries of the people whose names are there above them and came up with a very, very simple way to express what had been discovered collectively. So you have, all these great astronomers and physicists and mathematicians who are describing and explaining this and that. And Newton said, I finally figured out what you all have been talking about. You put a force on a mass and it will accelerate proportional to that mass. And then in stating that all of that discovery as a simple idea, what Newton did is gave practitioners this huge opportunity to act with much greater confidence and across a much broader range of situation than ever had previously existed. And I think that captures the MIT ethos, which is what we try to do as a community over the 150 plus years that the Institute has existed, is try and come up with simpler and simpler expressions for profoundly important ideas to give much greater range of action. So tying that back to the course, hardly comparing myself to Newton. I'm just sort of trying to emulate the example we set, right? So what we do in the course, whether it's online or in person, we introduce an idea, much like we've been doing during this discussion. We say, here's an idea, here's an example, and then we have opportunity for participants in person, online, to have conversation, the thought experiment about how those ideas would go into action. And we must repeat that over 2 days, a dozen different times. Here's an idea, here's an illustration. Now let's think about the application of ideas into action. Now, in terms of measuring impact, what we attempt to do is once the course formally concludes with a nice ceremony of presentation of certificates and this and that, we try to maintain the community. And whether it's students talking back to faculty, not just myself, but other faculty. I mean, this is just what we do at MIT. We keep talking about ideas into action, or conversation amongst participants themselves. We try to see how well the ideas work into action, get feedback on the ideas, get feedback on their presentation, give feedback onto their application, and keep this learning dynamic going. Long and short, I think we try to practice what we preach.
So good. That's good to know, and I can attest to the fact that we see a lot of feedback from people who've been through your courses that share examples of where they've had that kind of impact. So that's the real proof of the pudding is in the eating, as the expression goes. I think we're just about drawing to a close here, and this has been fascinating. I know we've barely scratched the surface of the book, which is a very rich resource as you described it, and I hope people will be able to find copies of it on bookshelves or online so that they can really dive into the book in depth for themselves. But I always like to try to end these things with, for those people that maybe don't have the time right now to go and digest the whole book, and then we'll have to wait a while for the course. Is there one piece of advice that you would give to anybody watching our discussion today of what they could do right now, or at least today, or maybe tomorrow morning, to begin moving in the directions that you advocate for in terms of being a much more dynamic learning?
No, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So first, ask us for the excerpt and the supplement I mentioned. Please ask us for those. We'll send those. You don't have to read the whole book. You can read a sample and get most of the ideas. But what to do today? All right. So here's the basic premise of the books, the courses, etc. Is that much better is possible. Much better is possible. And much better in terms of the experience of those for whom you're responsible, much better in terms of the experiences they're having, and much better in terms of the experience they're creating for those who are dependent upon your piece of the enterprise. So anyway, what can you do today? Go and watch. Go watch the people for whom you're responsible. And as you watch them, have in mind, what would perfect fluidity, perfect gracefulness look like in terms of them doing their work, ready to work with all the materials, all the information, all the skills, all the capabilities they need. So when they just open up that work, it just flows like ballet out of their minds through their hands to create value for someone else who will be hugely appreciative of that. And as you're watching with that image of ideal or perfect in mind, of perfect, graceful execution and performance, the moment the very first moment you see them have awkwardness, difficulty, impedance to the work they're doing, pause. This is the slowification. Tell them, hold on, don't succumb to the pressure of operational tempo. Let's pause. Let's figure out, why are you suffering this impedance right here, right now, and let's fix it. And then go back and maybe it won't be perfect gracefulness, and maybe it won't be perfect execution, but it'll be better. And then continue to watch. That's what you can do. Like literally, it's top of the hour +1. You can go watch someone for whom you're responsible and figure out how to make for them a better experience 10-15 minutes from right now.
Thank you, Steve. On behalf of everybody that has been watching this with us live, and everybody who watches the recording, which I know will be a large number of people as well, there's huge appreciation for your work and for the really compelling way that you share it through your written work and your teaching and through events like this. Just people are thanking us prolifically for having given you this opportunity to share your ideas, and we truly appreciate your partnership and your scholarship and your contribution to the field as well. Thank you so much, Steve Spear, for joining me on this LinkedIn Live.
Oh, thank you, Peter, for creating this this platform. It's such a marvelous one. The executive education as a whole for collaborative discovery. It's invaluable.
That's excellent. And thank you all who've been watching live and for your questions and comments that have really helped enrich this conversation. And I know Steve will be looking at and will be an input to his ongoing learning. And we'll look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in the upcoming courses or hearing from you as you get hold of the copies of the book and read them, or the other materials that we have been talking about that we will post in a place where people can get their hands on those as well. So thank you again, Steve. Thank you all for tuning in live. Thank you if you're watching the recording. And we'll look forward to seeing you, Steve, and others in future webinars, in future classrooms, and out in the world.
Thank you.